So, because I hate myself, I have decided to do another response to Prageru on the subject of capitalism versus socialism. I've done a couple responses to Prageru on this subject before on this channel. The first one was a response to Stephen Crowder, I believe, and the second one was a response to Nikki Haley. I actually have no idea who the fuck this guy is. I guess he's like a former CEO of Hardee's or something. Um, but nonetheless, he has certainly many things to say, and so we're going to respond to that. I guess before sort of getting into this video, it might be useful for context to give a brief outline of what I take socialism to mean, what I take capitalism to mean, how I understand the distinction between these two systems, and sort of a broad outline of the model of socialism that I would advocate for. Um, so, firstly, broadly, I take it that there are three kinds of goods in an economy. There are non produced assets, so things like land and natural resources. There are capital goods, so things like equipment, factories, things that are used as inputs to production. And then there are consumer goods, so things like TV, food, video games, clothes, things that like individual consumers consume. Um, and I take it that socialism roughly just means sort of collective, public, democratic ownership and control over capital goods and non produced assets while still allowing for private ownership of consumer goods. Whereas capitalism, on the other hand, is defined as sort of non collective, non democratic, but rather private ownership of individual capitalists over non produced assets and capital goods in a country. Um, and so that's my basic understanding. And then in terms of how we actually achieve socialism, or what will socialism look like, um, I follow a proposal which Matt Brunig calls nickel and dime socialism, where the idea is you basically have collective ownership of these things through government ownership. Government ownership takes a few different forms. So some industries would work well as general government services, so things like education or healthcare being run by the government, as exists in many countries. Um, you can have like state-owned enterprises which sort of run certain sectors. So, for example, like the post office is a state-owned enterprise. And then for sectors which aren't well suited to either of these kinds of government ownership, where we largely need markets to allocate the goods in a given sector, you can still have a sort of more indirect public ownership over those sectors through a social wealth fund. Now, a social wealth fund is just generally defined as a collectively held financial fund which is fully owned by the public and used for the benefit of society as a whole. These are also, the concept is also sometimes referred to as a citizens' wealth fund or a sovereign wealth fund, but whatever you want to call it, the idea is pretty simple. Basically, the government directly owns a large pool of income generating assets and then uses the return on those assets for social welfare purposes. So, for example, if you wanted public ownership of a certain sector like retail, but you didn't want to transform it, the entire sector, into like a big state owned enterprise or a general government service, you could have government ownership by just having the government buy up stocks in all of the various competing companies in that sector and then own those companies by having those stocks be transferred into the social wealth fund that the government owns. Um, so yeah, that's the basic idea. So you have state ownership on the one hand through those mechanisms, and then you also have in my proposal, broad pushes for more worker power over the places that they work at. This can take the form of large sectoral unions, like what exists in the Nordic countries, where over like 90% of workers are covered by these massive sectoral union contracts. You can have co-determination policies, where, for example, you are mandating that like a certain percentage of a company's stock is given to the workers, or that workers have representation on boards of directors and so on. You can also have policies that like encourage worker self-management of the firms that they work at and so on. And of course, I also advocate for high tax rates coupled with, which then of course go to fund large social welfare policies. And so that's the broad strokes of the democratic socialism that I advocate for. Yeah, with that all in mind, let's let's watch this Prageru video. Oh shit, this is not.
Capitalism versus socialism. We can sum up each economic system in one line. Capitalism is based on human greed. Socialism is based on human need, right? No. Wrong. So wrong. It's exactly backwards. And I'll prove it to you. Been on Amazon lately? Each of the thousands of products Amazon offers represents the work of people who believe they have something you want or need. If they're right, they prosper. If they're wrong, they don't. That's how the free market works. It encourages people to improve their lives by satisfying the needs of others. No one starts a business making a thing or providing a service for themselves. They start a business to make things or provide services for others. I speak from personal experience. When I was the CEO of the company that owns Carl's Jr. and Hardee's restaurant chains, we spent millions of dollars every year trying to determine what customers wanted. If our customers didn't like something, we changed it, and fast. Because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat us for lunch. The consumer, that's you, has the ultimate power. In effect, you vote with every dollar you spend. In a socialist economy, the government has the ultimate power. It decides what you get from a limited supply it decides should exist. Instead of millions of people making millions of decisions about what they want, a few people, government elites, decide what people should have and how much they should pay for it. Not surprisingly, they always get it wrong.
Okay, so just to stop right there and address some of those points. So the main argument that I'm getting here is this idea that capitalism is preferable to socialism because you have this situation where individual consumers can vote with their dollars on what they want to buy, and therefore the people broadly exercise control over the economy. And as a result of this, you get this situation where what's produced is in alignment with what society wants, right? Because obviously, in order for producing a good to be profitable, there has to be demand for that good. And so there's this coordination between what people want and what's produced. Now, the first thing that I want to note here is that these are advantages of markets, right? These are not advantages of capitalism. Because it's true that having this coordination and this ability to gauge demand and change what's being produced accordingly or update production accordingly, that is a big positive associated with markets. But you don't need private ownership of the means of production in order for markets to work in that way, right? You can have a market where the competing companies are owned democratically, publicly, by the people through social wealth funds or through co-ops would be another proposal, etc. And so these don't give us any reason to favor capitalism over socialism. Now, I want to go even further than that and say that to the extent that markets do have these benefits are severely hindered and limited by capitalism, and that by converting to a sort of market socialist economy, we could make all of these benefits much more profound. So let's run down the sort of the basic reasons why I think this. So for one, with respect to the idea that there's a coordination between what's good for society and what's profitable is sometimes true, right? Like if we imagine like a Venn diagram of what's profitable on the one hand and what's good for society on the other hand, there is a lot of overlap to be sure, right? Capitalists produce food. That's obviously good for society because it's profitable. Well, it's good for society, and capitalists produce it because it's profitable. The clothes that I'm wearing were profitable for a capitalist to produce, and it's also good for society for people to be able to have clothes, etc. So there is a lot of overlap there, but there's also a lot of non-overlap in that Venn diagram as well, right? And let's think of a few examples. So in the healthcare industry, it would be great for society as a whole in terms of sort of aggregate well-being if we provided everybody universal healthcare. But capitalists don't provide people universal healthcare because it would not be profitable to do so. It would be a massive loss in terms of profits. So the insurance companies don't do that. In fact, insurance companies engage in fairly ruthless behaviors to make sure that they have to cover as few sick people as possible. So, for example, like denying people with pre-existing conditions before it became illegal to do that. Another example, right? It would be good for society. It would increase happiness in society by a very large amount if we provided high-speed internet to rural communities. But the problem is rural communities have populations which aren't dense enough for them to be profitable for internet providers, and so internet providers do not provide high-speed internet to rural communities. And then on the flip side, we have examples like climate change, obviously, where it's not good for society long term to be pumping out fossil fuel emissions and polluting the atmosphere and so on, but it's very profitable for fossil fuel companies to continue polluting the environment, so they do it, even though it's bad for society. So what's the basic reason we have this non-overlap? The basic idea is this isn't a leftist point, right? This is commonly accepted in economics. This is what's called an externality. And the basic idea is that what any given company is trying to maximize under capitalism is profit. And the calculation for profit is revenue minus cost. So you're making a profit if the amount of revenue that you're bringing in from a business exceeds the amount that the business is costing you to keep itself running. And the problem is not all of the benefits which accrue to society as a result of engaging in a certain business practice or producing a certain thing directly goes back to the capitalist in the form of revenue. And not every cost which is imposed on society as a result of producing a certain good or not producing a certain good is reflected on the balance sheets of the capitalist in terms of direct costs, in terms of business operating. And so we have these situations where what's profitable and what's good or bad for society are not in alignment as we would want them to be. And through market socialism, we can bring these two categories into much closer alignment. So, for example, through state intervention, we can do things like subsidies to make it more profitable to produce certain things that are good for society. We can do Pigouvian taxes, like a prime example of this would be carbon taxes, to make it less profitable to produce things that we deem to be bad for society. We can use a social wealth fund to encourage the businesses that the government owns shares in to engage in practices that are better for society. In fact, we actually have real-world precedent for this if you look at how Norway manages its ownership. Norway has a very large social wealth fund, and we can look at how Norway's social wealth fund manages its ownership in companies. And typically what they do through their voting habits and their shareholder meetings is they encourage things like long-term value creation, respecting human rights, environmental stability, socially stable and transparent business practices, etc. And so I think that is a very profound advantage that a market socialist, heavily government-involved system has over capitalism. In addition to this, if we want to take this sort of capitalism is an economic democracy because we all vote with our dollars analogy seriously, it's hard to, okay, so let's say for the sake of the analogy, every dollar is worth one vote, right? It's hard to call a system a functioning democracy when someone can have billions of more votes than someone else, right? Because if every dollar is one vote, then Jeff Bezos has way more votes than I do. Like that's just obviously the case, right? And so if the idea is a democracy, if the idea of democracy is that everybody gets sort of equal say and equal participation in how society is run, then the economic democracy of markets would be greatly enhanced by a more compressed level of economic inequality. Now, why would socialism bring about less inequality? Well, the answer is fairly simple. There is trillions and trillions of dollars which float around our economy every year as a capital income. So basically, we just have this passive income called capital income, which flows to people who own capital. However, the ownership of capital is distributed in a very uneven way in society, such that the people who are earning all of this capital income are disproportionately a very small, very wealthy percentage of our society. And by redistributing ownership of capital through a social wealth fund, what you would get is a much more even distribution of money across everyone in the economy. Now, the final point that I want to mention is that while it's true that in some respect you are voting with your dollars when you're participating in a market, the question is, what are you actually voting on, right? So there are many things which socialists care about in terms of economic democracy. Things like the democracy in terms of workers being able to influence how the place that they work at is run. Things like the broader society being able to democratically influence the kinds of business practices that different businesses engage in with respect to promoting long-term value and social stability in terms of how they operate and so on. And so the next question is, does the sort of voting with dollars that we engage in at the supermarket actually meaningfully achieve those kinds of economic democracy? And the answer is obviously not, right? For a few reasons. So let's say you just have your average person who's at the store buying cereal. He's trying to decide whether to buy like Cheerios or Reese's Puffs, assuming those are owned by different companies. I don't actually know. What is this person voting on? Well, he's not going to be voting on, just statistically, he's likely not going to be choosing his preferred cereal brand based on the internal pay scales of the different companies that he could buy from, or by the business practices more broadly of the different companies that are trying to sell him cereal, right? And the reason for this is, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. Firstly, information with respect to how businesses operate on a more internal level is not always publicly available to consumers. Secondly, even if it was publicly available, most people probably aren't going to want to take the time to read up on the various business practices of different companies. And thirdly, even if they did feel like reading up on that, when you're buying cereal at the grocery store, it's very unlikely that your main concern is going to be, okay, I'm going to buy from the most ethical company, right? It's more likely that your average person is going to be more concerned with things like which cereal tastes better, or which cereal is cheaper, or which cereal do my kids want, etc. And so by having socialism, where you actually have the government and unions and the people sort of more democratically voting on how these different companies are going to operate and so on, you achieve that much more robust kind of economic democracy that is not achieved through the sort of free market capitalist model that the Prageru folks are trying to advocate for. I think that addresses everything that was said here.
Have you ever noticed that late-stage socialist failures always run out of essential items like toilet paper?
So
Of
true.
course, this isn't a problem for those who have the right connections with the right people. Those chosen few get whatever they want, but everyone else is out of luck. Venezuela, once the richest country in South America, is the most recent example of socialism driving a prosperous country into an economic ditch. Now, maybe you think it's an unfair example. I'm not sure why, but okay. We'll ignore the fact that leftist activists celebrated it as a great socialist success right up until it wasn't. But what about Western European countries? Don't they have socialist economies? People seem pretty happy there. Why can't we have what they have? Free healthcare, free college, stronger unions. Good question, and the answer may surprise you. There are no socialist countries in Western Europe. Most are just as capitalist as the United States. The only difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the US does. We can argue about the cost of these benefits and the point at which they reduce individual initiative, thus doing more harm than good. Scandinavians have been debating those questions for years. But only a free market capitalist economy can produce the wealth necessary to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy.
Okay, so yeah, let's address these arguments. So firstly, so the basic idea here is he says, hey, look at Venezuela. Venezuela was a socialist economy and then it collapsed. And then he anticipates an objection from a socialist like myself who might say, hey, well, we can look at the Nordic countries, which are pretty socialist and they seem to be doing pretty well. And then he basically says, well, no, okay, because the Nordic countries are not real socialism. The Venezuela is real socialism, right? Now, there's a few problems with this. Firstly, is sort of an initial less significant point. I like how he said something along the lines of, okay, well, let's ignore the fact that socialists said that Venezuela was socialist, like as if that's an argument in favor of it actually being socialist. Where even granting that socialists did say that, wouldn't that also mean, because if socialists say that the Nordic countries are socialist, then by that logic, shouldn't that make the Nordic countries socialist? If what socialists say is socialist is the metric, then you can't say that the Nordic countries aren't socialist, because by your own admission, socialists often claim that Nordic countries are socialist. So that's just sort of an initial funny point that I picked up on this time around. Now, in terms of the more substantive points, I just want to make the argument that based on roughly any economic metric we can look at, Norway turns out to be far more socialist than Venezuela is, right? So maybe the main way in which Norway and Venezuela are comparable are in terms of the fact that they both have a very large oil sector and their economy is largely based around their oil import or exports, and they both have a nationalized oil sector. So in terms of how they use their oil, Norway uses its oil money to build up a collectively owned capital stock, which then goes to fund social spending. Venezuela basically just skips the middle step and just uses the oil money to fund social spending. So insofar as socialism involves collective ownership of capital, Norway is far more socialist than Venezuela with respect to its usage of its oil money. But we can look at other economic metrics as well to make the same point. So although Venezuelan economic data is hard to come by, based on the data that we do have, it's very unlikely that the Venezuelan government owns 1/3 of the country's domestic corporate equity like Norway does. The Venezuelan government definitely does not own 60% of the national wealth like Norway does. On metrics like government, taxes, revenue, and expenditure, Norway is far to the left of Venezuela. Even if we want to look at something like proportion of Venezuelans who are employed by the public sector, even at the height of Hugo Chavez's rule, it was nowhere near the portion of people in the Nordic countries who are employed by the public sector. So basically, any metric you can look at, Norway certainly is going to come out as far more socialist than Venezuela. Now, in terms of an additional point, so let's just talk about why Venezuela failed as it did, and whether or not this is indicative of a problem with socialism, right? So basically, if you look at Venezuela's economy, Venezuela failed because it had a very large oil export sector, as I've previously mentioned. And then when oil prices plunged around like 2016-ish, the value of its exports shrunk significantly, and thus in turn the economy of Venezuela shrunk significantly. And then in response, to get themselves out of this situation, the government engaged in excessive levels of money printing, which then caused hyperinflation. And then obviously subsequent sanctions, which were placed on Venezuela by the U.S., made matters significantly worse. Does this have anything to do with socialism? Well, I mean, not really, insofar as socialism really has nothing to do with how much money printing we should be engaged in. That's kind of just a wholly separate issue. And again, like I've mentioned, we can look at countries like Norway, which also has an economy which is largely based around oil, and is far more socialist than Venezuela. And it dealt with the oil price plunge just fine, right? Norway is doing fine. And so I see really no reason to think that the collapse of Venezuela was a knock against socialism. It might be a knock against the Venezuelan government not understanding inflation, right? But that's just going to be a completely separate issue.
To get the free stuff, after all, you have to create enough wealth to generate enough tax revenue to pay for everything the government gives away. Without capitalism,
that's of course true that in order to pay for large welfare states, you need to be generating enough revenue. But I see no reason, and no reason has been presented by the speaker to suggest that a socialist economy wouldn't be able to produce as much growth and productivity as a capitalist society would be able to. And in fact, we have certain mechanisms which give us reason to think that a socialist economy would be able to be more productive than a capitalist economy. Most prominently, perhaps, we know that inequality, economic inequality, is a large hindrance on economic growth and poverty as well, because when a country is very economically unequal, it's much harder for people on the bottom end of that inequality to, have access to good schools, have access to good healthcare, develop their sort of human capital, and generally just become productive members of society. And so because socialism, through mechanisms that I described earlier, would greatly compress inequality, we have reason to think that more people being able to develop their human capital would lead to greater amounts of economic productivity. And there's actually empirical evidence for this as well. In 2014, there were 2 studies released, both of which I'll link in the description. One was from the OECD, the other one is from the International Monetary Fund, both of which found that redistributive policies aimed at compressing inequality are healthy and positive for economic growth for the exact reason that I just described. And also for other reasons as well. So, for example, it seems like lower levels of inequality leads to less social and political instability in a given country, which leads to investors feeling more comfortable investing in companies in that country, which leads to higher levels of economic growth. I guess we just have no reason to stipulate what he's arguing for here.
You're Venezuela. In a 2015 speech at Harvard, Denmark's prime minister took great pains to make this point. I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So when you point to Denmark as a paragon of socialism, you're really singing the praises of capitalism.
Okay, so a couple points to make with respect to that quote. The first point is just that like Lars Rasmussen is a right-wing politician in Denmark, so no shit he's gonna say that, right? Lars doesn't want the popular programs in his country to be associated with socialism because he's on the right, and so he's gonna try and sever that connection that people make, right? Like of course, but that's not really strong evidence. This would be like if I said, "Hey, look, at a speech, Bernie Sanders said that social security in the U.S. is evidence that socialism is great, and therefore that's just my entire argument is citing that quote from Bernie Sanders. It's like as much as I love Bernie Sanders, that's obviously that's not going to be a great argument. The rhetoric of a politically biased politician is not going to trump like general economic data that we have on the respective models of these different economies. The second thing that I want to bring up is that this is a pretty obvious example of a cherry picking fallacy. So he can pick right wing politicians like Lars who say that the Nordic country has nothing to do with socialism. I could just as easily cite former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, who self-identified as a democratic socialist and said that the policies which Sweden was implementing was specifically aimed at establishing socialism. And those policies are still very much in effect in large part in Sweden today. There's a variety of other self-identified socialist prime ministers that I could point to in the Nordic countries. There's also this, like, even if we take the quote at face value, right, what he says is that Denmark isn't a planned economy, Denmark is a market economy. But the only way that you would be able to extrapolate that as saying that therefore the Nordic countries are capitalist rather than socialist is if you were to assume that socialism just means central planning and capitalism just means markets. Obviously, that's not going to be an accurate definition. Most modern socialists don't even advocate for central planning. Most modern socialists advocate for the existence of some markets. And even the guy making this video himself must agree to this in order to avoid contradicting himself, right? Because this guy called Venezuela socialist, right? And Venezuela is not a completely planned economy. Venezuela was largely a market economy. And so if markets equal capitalism, then Venezuela was capitalist, right? So that's just so that conflation just isn't going to work. Now, another point that I want to make is that these countries, the Nordic countries, don't even need to be socialist for their success to lend credence to some models of socialism, right? So particularly, let's think about the model of socialism that I earlier advocated for, which is basically just a mixture of nationalizations, social wealth funds, sectoral unions, co-determination, etc., taxes and welfare, etc. Now, the Nordic countries, especially Norway has all of those things that I just listed to a very high degree, right? And then all of the other Nordic countries have most of those things that I listed. All of the Nordic countries have high degrees of unionization, high degrees of taxation and redistribution, high degrees of public ownership in their economy, with I think Denmark being the biggest exception to that rule. And then Norway especially has a social wealth fund, which is a big part of the socialism that I advocate for, and very, very, very high degrees of public ownership in general. And so would I call these countries fully socialist? Probably not. I would go further, right? But the point is that these countries have implemented basically all the policies that I've advocated for to some degree, and they've worked out quite well, which seems to lend credence to my position. So, like, one way you could think about this is that generally I take capitalism and socialism to be on a spectrum. So you can have a country that's more socialist, you can have a country that's more capitalist. And while the Nordic countries aren't fully socialist, they're much further in the direction of socialism than like any other country in the developed world, and they're also very successful. So, yeah.
The more capitalism, the less socialism you need. Look at America since 2017. A policy of lower taxes and less government regulation, that's more capitalism, has led to a robust economic expansion, something thought impossible.
Lower taxes and lower regulation equals more economy. So true.
Just a few years earlier. Unemployment,
Wait,
notably
okay, wait,
among
I'm
minority.
sorry. He said, like, it was previously thought impossible. Who thought that the growth rates that we saw under Trump were impossible, right? They're not even they weren't even unprecedented. Like, who is out here saying like 5% GDP growth? That's impossible. Like, okay, I mean, I'm open to being proven wrong if someone can find me a pundit saying that it is literally impossible to have those degrees of growth. But I'm highly skeptical that anybody credible was saying that.
Groups typically most at risk for poverty is at a generational low. Economic expansion gets people off welfare and into work. That's less socialism. None of this requires a degree.
Okay, so firstly, he cited like, oh, less people on welfare during the Trump presidency, during the sort of Republican rule of the country that existed for a few years. Firstly, I think that's true that less people were on welfare, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't because like the economy was so well that people were voluntarily choosing to go off of welfare. I'm pretty sure that was because the Republican Party was just cutting welfare programs, thus leading to less people being on them. Now, that's not going to be a point in favor of Trump, right? Because, or of the Republican Party's agenda, because the empirical data is overwhelmingly clear that higher levels of welfare leads to lower inequality, higher levels of social mobility, higher levels of entrepreneurship, higher levels of innovation, higher levels of economic growth, lower levels of poverty. And I can cite sources in the description. I've cited like sources for these claims ad nauseum on this channel before. So like, yeah, the idea that like cutting welfare is a point in favor of Trump is just not, it just doesn't make any sense. With respect to the numbers about GDP and unemployment, look, these unemployment admittedly was doing well under Trump and under the Republican Party, and so was GDP growth. But to pin this on the policies of the Republican Party or of Trump requires some further analysis, right? There are like an infinitely large amount of things that influence the GDP growth of a country at any given time. There's things like interest rates, which are set not by the president or by Congress, but by the Federal Reserve. There's a variety of other policies that the Federal Reserve engages in besides just setting interest rates, which influence these metrics to a large degree. There's sort of international markets influence the GDP growth in a given country. We mentioned earlier that things like plunges in the value of certain natural resources can influence largely the GDP growth in a country. There's a variety. The fact that we are probably still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis was probably impacting the rates of economic growth and unemployment benefits that we were seeing. And so just to point this, to make to observe that there's a correlation between Republican rule and these metrics, and then to say, therefore, it was Republican policies which led to us seeing these metrics, is just a classic example of the correlation causation fallacy, right? We need actual further analysis to demonstrate that these policies were the actual cause of the observed correlation. And so that's one problem. The other problem is just that these metrics were already improving under Obama and under when the Democrats were in control of Congress, right? So like, if you look at like unemployment levels between like the Obama administration and the Trump administration, I mean, the line just goes like this, right? I mean, it was a very solid trend. It's not like the trend started under Trump, or under the Republicans, so to assume that that was the cause of this trend, when it was an already existing trend is obviously very silly. But yeah, this is just a terrible way to do an economic analysis.
In economics. Common
Oh
sense is
shit, what's that?
all you need. That's why it's so frustrating to see young people praising socialism and criticizing capitalism. It's bad enough that they're working against their own interests, better job prospects, better wages, personal freedom. But they're also working against the interest of the less fortunate. Capitalism leads to economic democracy. Socialism leads to the economic dictatorship of the elite.
Damn.
Always and everywhere. So beware what you ask for. You just might get it. I'm Andy Puzder,
God,
the
I
author
hope
of The
so.
Capitalist Comeback.
All right. Anyways, yeah, obviously that guy was full of shit. It's a Prageru video, so not much of substance was said. But at least, hopefully, after watching this video, you might have learned, some responses that can be levied against the sort of classic level zero, brain dead conservative anti-socialist talking points. So yeah, I guess since it's the end of the video, I'll give a shout out to all of my $10 patrons as a condition of their patronage. That being Tyler, Eloy Points, Eduardo Squidwardo, Raven, Benny G, SJEW Nelson, Alex Manzoni, Alexander Adams, Liam Offer, and Isocratic. Thank you to everybody who supports me. It means a lot, and it gives me, obviously, more impetus to continue doing what I'm doing. Yeah, if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, you can become a $10 patron, or you can just become a $5 patron. Either way, you will have access to Patreon exclusive essays that I write about the same kinds of topics that I talk about on here. So yeah, check that out if you're interested. If not, thanks for watching nonetheless. I really appreciate it.